Hello, everybody. My name is Brandon Holland, and this is the final project for comparative effectiveness in athletic training. And I am comparing heat versus ice in acute care for lateral ankle sprains. So, here's a little bit about the epidemiology of lateral ankle sprains. They are responsible for almost 800,000 trips to the emergency room every year, and each of those trips can cost upwards of $1,400 per visit. And so they generate costs sometimes in excess of $1 billion every year, which is a huge amount of spending for medical care. And it's also estimated that over 60% of all athletic injuries are lateral ankle sprains. So typical care for lateral ankle sprains includes price, which we're all familiar with: protection, rest, ice compression, and elevation. We protect and rest the injury when it's most vulnerable to allow healing to occur. We compress and elevate the injury to limit swelling and edema and to control whatever tissues may be bleeding. And there are also different reasons that we might choose ice. So, why do we choose ice? For pain modulation. Again, it also assists in controlling edema. The lowering of the tissue temperatures is believed to limit or stem inflammation, the inflammatory process. And this also slows metabolism, which will limit the effect of secondary hypoxic injury, limit the spread of secondary hypoxic injury. So, what evidence do we use when we decide to select ice? Typically, is expert opinion. So, there's not that many studies out there that really validate the effectiveness of ice in acute care in living people. And there's also not that many studies, almost none. I did a very thorough search and I found zero studies of randomized trials that compared cryotherapy to thermotherapy in acute care. So all of these generations, basically, we've been just most primitive modalities. We haven't had any real concrete evidence, just mostly expert opinion, which is not necessarily a bad thing. So what do we do? Do we continue to trust the experts, or do we conduct studies to gather more tangible evidence? So in my study, my clinical question was, for patients with lateral ankle sprain, is acute care with cryotherapy more effective at reducing disability than acute care with thermotherapy? My population would be high school athletes, and to be included, they would have to have a lateral ankle sprain within the previous 24 hours of their visit to my clinic. And they would have to participate in football, field hockey, volleyball, wrestling, basketball, soccer, or lacrosse. They would be excluded if they had concomitant fractures with their sprain, or if they had additional injuries beyond just the lateral ligaments of the ankle, or if they received treatment from another clinician in another clinic. So the research design that I selected is randomized block trial. And I like randomized because it's random. I like the block because it limits within your sample different categories of people, so you are able to compare more apples to apples. So I would block males and females into separate blocks, and then within those blocks, those subjects would be randomized to either receive uh, protection, rest, ice compression, and elevation, or protection, rest, heat compression, and elevation. And these treatments would take place for 30 minutes twice a day. And so to compare the effectiveness, what we would use as the outcome of interest is the score, or rather the change in score, of the foot and ankle ability measure. So if you're not familiar, the foot and ankle ability measure, or the FAM as it's called, is a patient-reported outcome that allows patients to describe how a foot or ankle ailment is causing a disability in them. And so subjects would submit their first FAM in 24 hours, or their first visit, and they would submit their final FAM at 72 hours post-injuries. And basically I would measure the difference in the scores for each individual. And the group that had the greatest average increase in score for the foot and ankle ability measure would have recorded the greatest reduction in disability. So why is this significant? Basically, it would be significant. It didn't matter what the outcome was. This would be significant because it's groundbreaking. No one's ever really done it before study this type of phenomenon with this type of research. So if we found that ice was better than heat, we'd be like, yeah, that's what we thought. So we wouldn't really change a whole lot of what we do, but at least the idea would be supported by a randomized trial. And we would still need more research to validate or maybe dispel the results. If we found out that heat were better than ice, that might be something we didn't see coming. So we might want to consider, in the face of such evidence, changing our traditional course of managing acute injuries. But of course, we would need more research to see if we could duplicate those results as well. If we found that both ice and heat were pretty good, who knew? You can choose either or. What patients would like about that is they could pick their preferred modality. So people who have trouble sitting in a slush bucket or the ice bath can choose a warm modality and achieve the same effect, and they would be more cooperative throughout the course of their therapeutic process. And of course, because it would be one of the first studies of its kind, you would still need more research. And what if we found out that neither ice or heat really did what we thought they were doing all of this time? That might be a bit surprising, but still allowing patients to choose may enhance their cooperation in their therapeutic process, and they would have better results otherwise because they are coming in and owning their rehab process or their therapeutic process. As far as feasibility, conducting research outside of a research setting sometimes can be challenging. So in a research setting, athletic trainers or clinicians of any medical field in a research setting typically have time dedicated to conducting their research. Their organization will dedicate or allocate money and resources to conducting that research. And there will be administrative support, as the typical goal of a research facility is to conduct research. So administrators are always on board with conducting research. In a clinical setting, it's a little bit different. We have to spend our time running the clinic, and we have to do research wherever we can fit it in. So time is not typically dedicated in a block for our workday to conducting research. Also, the money and resources in a clinical setting are typically allocated to funding the day-to-day operations of the clinic. So not necessarily a high priority on the list is research in that instance. And administrators are usually concerned with running the clinic and, again, not necessarily conducting new research. So how do we get around these obstacles? I think the best way is to start small by picking something that's easy and inexpensive to track, easy to record, easy to measure, easy to manipulate. It's usually a phenomenon that's already happening in our clinics, and we just haven't been tracking it as much as we could or in the method that we could. So we want to collect that data and study it, and then take what evidence we get from that data and make changes to our practice, and then see if those changes in our practice will affect the outcome of interest. If it does, we want to document that evidence and then take it to our superiors, and maybe we could use that evidence to as leverage to ask for more funding for our clinic, or more supplies, or more equipment, or maybe even more human resources. So that is my presentation, done in under 9 minutes, and these are my references. I can read them to you if you really, really, really want me to, but I can tell you really, you're okay if I don't. So I look forward to your feedback, and I also look forward to seeing your studies on the discussion board. Thank you, and have a great night.